Good morning. It's time for us to begin our class this morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to our class. It's good to see a large number this morning. Appreciate you being here. We're going to continue our study in evidences this morning. And as shown on the screen here, we'll be spending our second class talking about evidences that God exists. And as we did last week, most of what we talk about this morning will also be extra biblical evidences, if you will. Really, most of the rest of the class for this quarter will be focused on things that the Scriptures have to say and why we should believe that the Scriptures come from God, and then some specific topics from the Scriptures. This morning we'll be looking once again at evidences and based upon science and extra biblical support. If you would, open your songbooks to number 90. We'll start by singing this song together this morning. Lead us in a prayer, and then we will have a discussion together. Dear God, we're so thankful for the opportunity we have to come together this morning to open your word and to study about you and your care for us and your creation, that we can see your power in the world around us. Pray that you'd be with our class this morning and help us to be built up in our faith. Help us to recognize the blessings that we enjoy as your children. And be with our congregation here and with all of the classes this morning and the teachers and the children in their classes. Help all of us to grow in our understanding of you and in our love for you. Help us to build up one another, but most importantly, to bring praise to you that's fitting as our Creator and our Father. Pray that you would continue to watch over us and protect us and guide us and be with those who are not able to be with us this morning, and pray that if it's your will, hindrances would be removed and they can be with us again. Be with those who are joining us through streaming and help them to be encouraged from the lessons that we talk about. We're most thankful for Christ, his sacrifice, and his example for us. Pray that you would help us to replace our will more fully with his each day. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so what stands out from those verses that we sang to you, particularly in relation to what we've talked about in this class the last few weeks about God existing? What do you see there? Eric?
Just evidence of creation.
Okay.
To the power of God.
The power of God that we see from creation. What else? Thomas?
Well, it was my mind about each star is named.
Okay. Yeah, verse 2. The stars he numbers and their names he gives to all those. And we'll talk about that specifically, the idea that in God's creation he is intimate with his creation. Each star is named. And we'll look at the passage here in a minute that talks about that. Any other observations from those?
There's so many things that we accept just as nature, just as being there.
Okay.
Just like the seasons, just like, well, I think it made a reference in here, the child being formed in the womb, we accept that as just nature. But
Okay.
God is the one that's in control.
Okay. The fact that what we maybe take for granted as just being the way things work goes back to God. And I think talks about that quite a bit. Let me move ahead here. I do want to remind us, our primary focus for this quarter is going to be to increase our faith through increasing the truth that we understand about God, and be prepared to make a defense to anyone that asks us for a reason for the hope that's in us. And we talked about last week, does God exist? And we looked at these first two arguments, one based upon the beginning of the universe. And remember, we talked about the fact that anything that has a beginning has a cause, and that the evidence points toward an intelligent maker as the cause of the beginning of the universe. And then we talked about the design of the universe in the last part of class last week, and that providing evidence of an intelligent designer when we look at the complexity of the universe. Today we'll spend most of our time talking about two more arguments that you see here. One is a similar argument about design, but rather than being based on the universe, it's going to be based on the design of life. And so we'll talk about that. And then the last one, it's a little bit different type of argument, if you will. There's not as much hard and fast material evidence to support the idea of the argument from a moral law, but we'll talk about that one as well. And then near the end of class, we'll hit a few other arguments just as an introduction quickly that you can do your own research and get into. Obviously, there's many books written on this topic about evidence for God, and we're not going to cover any other arguments in depth beyond these four, but we will hit these last two today in some depth. So the beginning of the universe, I mentioned this, we looked at this, everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. So that's the argument, the cosmological argument, if you want to use that term. And then the second one, as I mentioned, we looked at the precision of the universe, that every design has a designer. The universe has a highly complex design, therefore The universe had a designer. That's what the evidence points toward. And just as a summary, talked about at the end of class, these premises about a designer are true. Therefore, the evidence points toward an intelligent designer. This is a quote from Dr. Robin Collins. You can see here, professor of philosophy with degrees in math, physics, and philosophy. And he writes, "Only recently have we discovered how precise every condition had to be in so many areas for us to have this universe that allows life. The deeper we dig, we see that God is more subtle and more ingenious and more creative than we ever thought possible." And this is a summary statement, if you will, but there's lots of statements like this from scientists, particularly in the last 100 years or so, in looking at the universe and what's required to sustain life and for life to begin, that point toward the requirement for an intelligent designer. So let's move ahead to think, or actually, as we think about the universe, and Charles actually mentioned this, the breadth of the universe is just beyond our mind capability to understand. But I want to just throw out a couple of things for you to think about in relation to the universe and the stars, as we've already mentioned and sung about. The estimated universe that's observable today by the best methods that science can use is 93 billion light years across. And 1 light year is 63,000 astronomical units. An astronomical unit is the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So take the distance from the Earth to the Sun times 60,000 times 93 billion, and that tells you the size of the universe. There are at least now, from observations that we're able to make with the strongest telescopes and other observations, at least 70 septillion stars in the known universe. Now that number is one of those that we can't wrap our head around, obviously. But that's a incredibly large number. Perhaps a way to kind of bring it down to earth, if you will, is to say they estimate now that there's 10,000 stars in the universe per every grain of sand on Earth. So think about standing in a desert, how much sand that is. Per grain of sand on Earth, it's estimated there's 10,000 stars in the universe. So unfathomable breadth of creation that God has put in place. And the scriptures point toward this going way back, even into the Psalms and Isaiah writing as a prophet, and talks about and encourages us to look at the heavens and to think about God. And this picture, I think Eric showed this same picture maybe a month or two ago, but this is one of the latest pictures from the Webb telescope we have now that can see the farthest into the outer reaches of space. And this is a picture that if you had a grain of sand between your fingers and you hold it at arm's length, so think about that. You're holding a grain of sand at arm's length, and hold that up and look at the sky. This is a picture of what part of the sky you're seeing. So this is 1 grain of sand at arm's length looking up at the sky. This is what the telescope can see. And these are galaxies that appear in this picture here. Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." So we see this encouragement to look to the heavens and think about God and his power. Isaiah 40 verses 25 and 26, this is the passage that Charles actually mentioned. "Who created these, calling them all by name?" And it's referencing the stars. And then it goes on in the next chapter. Isaiah says you should look at that breadth and compare it to God's love. That's the passage that says his love is similar to the scale of the sky, to the universe. So just wanted to hit those points as we think about the incredible breadth of God's creation as evidenced in the universe. And sort of use that as a transition as we think about moving on to think about God's design as evidenced in the design of life. As I mentioned, a lot of what we now view as scientific fact, and I guess is scientific fact because we can observe it, has really come to be over the last 100 years or so. The Hubble telescope started being used, or Hubble started looking through telescopes with a lot of power in the late 1920s. And in kind of that 100 years, we've gone from a limited understanding of the scale of the universe to a much better understanding because of the improvements in science. Similarly, starting in about 1950, scientists have been able to go the other direction, if you will. And rather than looking at the breadth of the universe, they've been able to look at things that are smaller and smaller and smaller and see evidence for design from an intelligent designer like God. And design of life is perhaps the most complex example of that. So we want to look at that. And again, use similar argument to what we've looked at before. Every design had a designer. Living things have a highly complex design, which we'll talk about. Therefore, the evidence points toward living things having a designer, an intelligent designer as well. So the second premise says living things have a highly complex design. So let's talk a little bit about how complex is the design in life, in living things. And everybody's seen this picture or something similar. It's DNA. Again, this wasn't discovered until the early 1950s. So in the span of time, this is a relatively new discovery. But DNA is the basis for living things. And I want to read just a brief summary of what DNA is. It's a molecule that contains the biological instructions that make each species unique. DNA, along with the instructions it contains, is passed from adult organisms to their offspring during reproduction. It's made of chemical building blocks called nucleotides. And there won't be a test on this, so don't worry about that. Called nucleotides. But these are made of 3 parts, a phosphate group, a sugar group, and one of 4 types of nitrogen bases. To form a strand of DNA, these nucleotides are linked into chains with phosphate and sugar groups alternating. So this is a very complex chemical structure. The 4 types of nitrogen bases found in the nucleotides are what we commonly see in DNA as the A, T, G, and C nucleotides. And those are specific chemicals. And the order of these in this chemical structure determines what biological instructions are contained in a strand of DNA. So for example, if you have a sequence that's ATC, GTT, you might have blue eyes. If you have a strand that's ATC, GCT, so just change the order, you end up with brown eyes. And that's true for everything that we have in our living bodies. This complete DNA instruction book, or as it's now called, the genome, the human genome, for a human contains about 3 billion of these bases. So 3 billion in one human, about 20,000 genes on 23 pairs of chromosomes. So the complexity here is, again, beyond our mind's ability to wrap around. It's this helical structure, but I do want to reinforce what I mentioned there, that the order of these connections in the rungs, the A, T, C, G connections, the 4-letter DNA alphabet, if you want to use that term, matters. If you change the order of these at all, you get different traits. So it's not just a matter of the things coming together and life being formed. There has to be information that provides the recipe for those things coming together in the correct way. Chris, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just find it kind of ironic that as much science as we know and biology as we know, that members of our own Congress and Senate can't even distinguish what is between a male and a female. How can they, have this and then not agree on it?
Yeah.
Crazy?
Yeah. We'll get into that topic, but it is. Let's then expand that to thinking about what would have been required. And it's interesting, if you look at the scientific literature today, much of the discussion is around the difficulty of Darwin's theory from the standpoint of how did it begin. So we often, a lot of times talk about, and it's mentioned in our lesson book and the lesson for today as well, the idea of micro versus macro evolution, and microevolution occurs. We don't have any evidence for macroevolution. That's all true. But it's even more true that the true Darwinists have more trouble explaining how did the origin occur because of the complexity that is required for life to spring into existence. And that's a big part of the scientific debate. But think about, from a simple life, an amoeba is the example we're going to use here. So a one-celled amoeba, this is a small enough creature that you could have several hundred in an inch. So you're talking about a very simple one-celled amoeba. That one-celled amoeba has as much information in its DNA, coded into the structure that we were talking about, as in 1,000 complete sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And again, it's not just in random order. It's these letters arranged in the appropriate way, in the appropriate order, such that that information is ordered in order for that life to be able to exist. And as I mentioned, these 1,000 sets have all of these letters in a specific order, just like written words in an alphabet. So if the order is not correct, then there's not going to be life and it's not going to be sustained. I think that argues for an intelligent design as a basis. To support that, I do want to mention this idea and just take a couple of minutes to talk about it. There's a principle called the principle of uniformity, and I wrote here, it's you may think about it more as common sense, but if we look at something today and recognize what is required for it to be caused, there's basically two ways that things can be created from a cause. We've talked in the past about if something had a beginning, then it had a cause. Well, what type of causes are there? In the biggest sense, there's only intelligent causes or unintelligent causes. And unintelligent causes is more commonly referred to as natural causes. So that's really your only two choices. If something's come into existence, a cause made it occur, it either came from an intelligent cause or a non-intelligent cause. If we look at the world around us, we all the time make assumptions without even thinking about it. What came from an intelligent cause and what could have come from a natural cause, or what came from a natural cause. The example shown here, if you go to the Grand Canyon, you can understand, and science can explain, or you go to any canyon anywhere in the world around us here, you can explain or understand how that could have come about from a natural cause. Water could flow, erode rocks, and you could end up with a formation that looks like something we see in canyons, or even in the Grand Canyon. If you go to Mount Rushmore, you looked at Mount Rushmore, would you conclude that, well, look at that, rain fell and these faces appeared on Mount Rushmore? We don't think that way because we have this idea in our mind, even though we don't call it that, but we understand that something intelligent had to purposefully create that appearance of faces in the mountainside. So it had to come from an intelligent cause. We understand that. So think about that. Only an intelligent being could make Mount Rushmore. And then think about the complexity that we've talked about even in the amoeba for simple life. Seems very logical, almost undeniable, that only an intelligent being could make something of that complexity. It's not just going to naturally come into being. Any comments there? I'll pause. Thoughts that come to mind? Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things that these intelligent design scientists have come up with, you talk about DNA and RNA.
Yeah.
And RNA is what gives the DNA its code, and DNA is what creates RNA. Okay, so the question is which came first?
Yeah.
Because you can't have one without the other.
Right.
They are absolutely dependent upon one another. So which came first?
Yeah.
And the answer is they had to come at the same time.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's just an observation.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Yeah, so Tom was saying that DNA and RNA is how DNA multiplies, I guess is an appropriate term to use, and both are required. And there's also DNA makes proteins, and proteins are required to make DNA, to be the substance of DNA. So you have these problems with which would come first if you're going to approach it from a natural evolutionary perspective. Neither could exist without the other. And I think bees and plants were mentioned in the lesson book. It's this idea of symbiosis, that you can't have things that require one another evolve naturally. It just doesn't work that way. So there's lots of arguments that way that apply here as well as other places. Other observations or thoughts on this idea? Yeah.
I just pause and look at RNA and DNA. Should we be messing with God's creation with vaccines and stuff like that? It's a question I think a lot of people ask themselves.
Yeah.
God created us and our immune system to fight a lot of different things. And with instructions, why do we need to, tinker with God's creation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fair question. I think it's something for to be thought about is where are the limits of medical intervention? Let's move ahead to think about the idea, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I do want to hit it as well because I think it's an important concept, of irreducible complexity. I'm going to use IC for short to refer to irreducible complexity, and I get into the definition here of an irreducibly complex system, and this was mentioned in the lesson book also. But an IC system is composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any part causes the system to cease functioning. Now that's somewhat of a complicated definition, but it's easy for us to understand. The picture of the mousetrap is the common simple example for this. If you take any of the parts out of that mousetrap, it's not going to work. You can't take the spring out and say, well, I've still got 80% of the parts, so it's going to be 80% as effective. It doesn't work that way. We get that. Car engine is another example. If you take one part out of a car engine, it's not going to operate at 99% efficiency. It's just not going to work because all the parts have to work together in order for them to achieve their function. The thing is that we see this type of design, this irreducibly complex design, throughout life, throughout biology. And Michael Behe has written a book that you've probably heard about, I think it came out around 20 years ago, called Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. And a lot of his argument is based on this idea that there's so much complexity in life that it could not evolve and reach that level of complexity because it's irreducibly complex. You could never get to the level of complexity that now we see throughout the cell, throughout living things, because numerous functions in the body are irreducibly complex. And I'll list a few of them here, and you can read about this and go into great depth. But blood clotting is one that requires an amazing number of systems operating perfectly in order for our bodies to be able to clot blood appropriately. Otherwise, we would die anytime that we had an injury that requires our blood to clot. Cilia is another example, and it's interesting that this is one of those cases where as scientists are able to see into smaller and smaller things, they're able to see these cell propulsion organisms called cilia. This is how cells move around within cells. And these are more complex than any engines that we've been able to develop as mankind over the history of mankind, using energy efficiently to move things around. And then vision is another one where irreducibly complex. Lots of things happen in our eyes and in our brains that work together in order to enable us to see. And all of those systems have to be working effectively. It couldn't just evolve into that. And there's numerous other examples, as I mentioned. Again, reinforce this idea of what we talked about already, but each human cell, take that in mind, each human cell in our body has 3,000 million pairs of these A, T, C, and G bases. And the body has trillions of cells in our body. And we make millions of new cells every second. It's unbelievable to think about this complexity. So each cell in and of itself, biologists are now able to see is irreducibly complex. And within the cell, there are subsystems that are also irreducibly complex. So the complexity of life is increasingly recognized that there's not a natural explanation for how this could occur. So this argument from the complexity of life, the premises are true, life is complex, and these irreducibly complex systems are strong evidence of a purposeful, intentional design by an intelligent agent. No other theory succeeds. This is a quote from that same Darwin's Black Box book. But increasingly now in the scientific community, this is recognized. There's really not an alternative theory to how life could start other than an intelligent designer. So that's a summary of that argument. Any comments, thoughts, questions? Just thankful that everything works right in our very complex bodies. All right, let's move ahead to this last argument that we're going to look at in depth around the moral law. And this one, as I mentioned, it's a little bit different. Every law has a lawgiver. A moral law exists. Therefore, moral law has a moral lawgiver. it's indisputable. No one disputes that every law has a lawgiver. That's almost definitional. So we'll talk about the question, does a moral law exist? Because if it does, then there must be a moral lawgiver. I want to give you a couple of quotes, one from C.S. Lewis and one from Thomas Jefferson here. C.S. Lewis writes a lot in his book Mere Christianity and other writings, so I'd encourage you to look at those about this idea of a moral law. And I would, one thing I meant to mention, this previous argument we were talking about around DNA has become a very strong argument in the atheist community and in the scientific community. And I wanted to mention, I think it was mentioned in our book, there's a book called There Is a God, and it's originally said there is no God. No is marked out and has an A written in. There is a God, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. And this is a British scientist by the name of Anthony Flew, who for around 50 years was one of the top debaters in the world from an atheist perspective. He was a staunch atheist. He debated with C.S. Lewis and others for many, many years, and he converted to belief in an intelligent creator when he was in his late 70s, early 80s years of age, after 50 years of being one of the world's leading atheists. And what convinced him that an intelligent designer was required was what we just talked about, the complexity of life and DNA. So just wanted to share that. This is an interesting book if you like history mixed with science. It's got some of both. Mention that to say this idea of a moral law is really what converted, if you want to use that term, C.S. Lewis from being an atheist to being a leader in Christian thought. C.S. Lewis, when he was in his teen years and maybe early 20s, had questions about the existence of God. He was an atheist, and as he thought about moral law, he reached the conclusion that there has to be a moral lawgiver. So just wanted to mention that. Here's one of the quotes from his book. Think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who'd been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. So the point he's making here is that there are morality principles that are timeless across cultures, across the world that people have. And that had to come from somewhere. Second point here from our Declaration of Independence points toward the idea that the moral law is a basis for human rights. And of course, this is a quote that we're very familiar with, but it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, by the Creator, with certain unalienable rights." Think about the argument being made here by Thomas Jefferson and by our founders. They didn't say, our opinion is that men should have these rights. They said, the Creator has given mankind these rights. That's a very different argument, and it appeals to the idea that there is a standard. There is a moral law that's beyond what we think or what we come up with or what we reason to or our opinions that stated here. These are self-evident truths. People just know these because they're put into us by our Creator. Interesting that that's written into our Declaration of Independence. So let's think about a few more points here in connection with this idea of a moral law. And we're not going to talk about all these in depth. Again, you can read on this, and I can give you some other recommendations of things to read on this. But first one I want to point out is that the moral law is undeniable. I've been kind of talking about that. It's self-evident. Those who deny all values, and there are some people who will say there are no values, but in even doing that, they value their right to be able to make that statement and have it respected. So there are moral laws that are undeniable. Our reactions help us to discover the moral law. And you can think of examples of this where, we may argue there's no moral law, but if something happens that is unjust or unfair to us or to anyone, they're going to react. We're going to react. Where does that reaction come from? If we're just natural animals, that we don't get upset, or people don't get upset when you see an animal attack another animal in the wild, because that's what they are designed to do. If a person attacks another person in the wild, we don't just say, well, that's a stronger person. We don't think that way. It helps us to discover the moral law. There be no basis for human rights. Mentioned that already. We couldn't know justice or injustice. If there's no standard, then there's no justice. And we talked about this kind of when we were talking about truth earlier, but if you can't appeal to something bigger than your opinion, then it just becomes a discussion about relative morals, which are not really morals at all. Without the moral law, there'd be no way to measure moral differences. We talked about that. And actually, I want to read you another C.S. Lewis quote in regard to that, because I think it's helpful in that regard. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are in fact comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral ideas can be truer and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. And he was writing during the time of World War II, so he refers to the Nazis as an example here of, if you don't have a standard, then what the Nazis think is no different than what anyone else thinks. They're entitled to their opinion, unless you're appealing to a third different standard that is outside of opinion of men. So that's the idea of this moral law being a requirement that we rely on. Similar to that, without a moral law, you couldn't know what's right or wrong. Some people today, some atheists today will talk about the fact that you can't define what's right because it's up to the individual. But we don't experience that in reality, and we don't see that for the things we've been talking about here. Without the moral law, there's no moral grounds for political or social dissent. Again, it just becomes whoever's the most powerful gets to enforce their opinions, and there's no basis you can appeal to for those opinions being right or wrong if there's not a moral law. And if there's no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. I think this is an interesting one to think about. And this kind of comes back to the idea of conscience, which is talked about in the scriptures, but people recognize and defend themselves if they're doing something that is not in line with general principles of what is moral and what is immoral. And that's, I think, built into us as the way that we are designed by the designer. So again, you can go into all of these in much more depth, but wanted to give you kind of an introductory overview there. So this moral argument, the premises are true. I think that's upheld. And here's another quote that I think is helpful, again from C.S. Lewis. Human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. So we may call that conscience, right? You ought to behave in a certain way, and you can't really get rid of that thought. Secondly, that they do not, in fact, behave that way. And we recognize that as well, right? We know some things that we want to do or we think we should do, and we don't do them. And we see the scriptures talk about that. They know the law of nature, if you want to call this moral law coming a law of nature, but they break it. These two facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in, C.S. Lewis says. And again, this is the idea that this moral law that's outside of our thinking is a strong argument that there must be a moral lawgiver that has these ideas that were laid down that are principles that are understood throughout humanity. Comments on that? I know I went through that kind of quickly. Yes, Jerry?
Whenever you have a law, there are consequences of breaking that law.
Right. Yes. And without a law, there would be none. So, excellent point. Jerry was saying, when you have a law, there are consequences, and that relates back to justice and right and wrong. Yes, John?
I think something else you can look at is when you have someone who's like a sociopath who doesn't understand right and wrong, that makes us very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Where does that discomfort come from?
Yeah. Yeah, great point. All right, as I mentioned, I do want to mention a couple of other arguments that we're not going to get into in depth, but I would encourage you to think about, and if you have interest, you can look at them. One is the argument of consciousness. And this is the question of, we as humans are different from all other creatures that we know of, in that we can think about what we're thinking. And people say this different ways, but we have an ability to analyze, to introspect within ourselves about what our thinking is. So we're not just wired naturally to do one thing or do the other. And if you think about it, without this ability for man, really, there would be no freedom to choose to do right or wrong if everything that we do is just a natural result of whatever stimulus comes into us and our brain acts the way that it acts. We have something beyond that. And the scriptures talk about that as the soul. But this idea of a mind, a consciousness, something that's beyond just our physical makeup is an argument that had to come from somewhere other than physical evolution. And again, a lot can be said about that. I think it's a very, very strong argument that is very difficult for people to counter with any argument from science regarding where does the mind come from? Where does our idea of future hopes and beliefs come from if the only things that exist are actually just stuff and matter? So that's an idea of argument from consciousness. Symbiosis, we already talked about that, and there's lots of these that you can look at. Here's a couple, bees and plants that was mentioned in your lesson book. DNA and protein is another one, and there's a long list of these you can find that talk about things that could not have independently evolved because they're both required to work together. And then, as was mentioned in the book, there's a long list of biblical scientific evidences as well. And this sort of transitions into looking at why should we believe, as we'll talk about the next couple of weeks, that the Bible that we have is the book that's been given to us by this intelligent designer we've been talking about, by God. Why should we believe that the Bible comes from God? And these biblical scientific evidences, I think, can help support that idea, but also just support the idea that there must be a intelligent being who could make that information known before science could discover it. And examples that were in the lesson book around spherical Earth, suspended Earth, ocean springs, etc. Are arguments there. And there's many others. I think we've hit the major ones over the last couple of weeks. And again, in this class, we really just want to set this as a foundation, that there are lots of reasons, there are lots of evidences that very strongly support, I would say beyond a reasonable doubt, that there is an intelligent God that created us and created the world around us and everything that we know. And we're going to transition into, has that God talked to us? We've been really focused on general revelation, if you want to use that term. We can see the power of God in the world around us. But what does that God want from us? And has he revealed that to us, is what we'll be transitioning to. So actually, if we've got a couple of minutes left, go back to number 90 in your songbook. Let's sing this song one more time, but I want to sing all 4 verses.